Okay, welcome. Hope everybody had a chance to go out last night and check out what Ottawa has to offer. It looks like some of you had a really good time, and others stayed up a little later. And yeah, so we're good. I've got a little housekeeping. We did have one poster board for signatures. There are two others that are here. They're going to be Sean. Where are they? They'll be out over here somewhere if you'd like to sign them as well, sort of thing, because there are three groups from the Treasury Board that are going they're over there. Thank you. So if you could sign the other two if you haven't had a chance, that'd be great. Show our support for those members. So we'll start out. Oftentimes you're asked to get involved in different campaigns, or sometimes your local wants to launch a campaign or something that's happening in your specific workplace. The key to any campaign is an effective messaging. To help us learn more about that, I'm pleased to introduce you to Nora Loreto, who most of you might have met yesterday. Nora is the comms editor. She's a writer, musician, activist based in Quebec City with expertise in media literacy, social media, extreme snark, and government relations. Nora's the author of From Demonized to Organized, Building the New Union Movement, and contributed a chapter on the debt and youth activism in Canada after Harper. She writes regularly for Rabble.ca and progressive magazines. Nora is the director of the Canadian Freelance Union, is on the board of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and is involved in her local coordinating committees for campaign solidarity. Please help me welcome Nora Loreto.
Yeah, we'll go. Sure. Thank you. I got to update that bio because I was voluntold to be president of my union this year, so no longer just a director. Okay, how is everyone this morning? You're good? Okay, feel like we're all at Mass together, right? Sunday morning? No, that's a church joke. Sorry, everybody. Yeah, I did work for the Catholic Church for a period of time. I'm gonna figure out how this all works up here. There we go, very cool. And I guess, yeah, it's perfect. I can just talk until the end of the day. Oh, there, now it's going. Okay, perfect. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about campaigns messaging, and campaigns messaging is really, really, really important. If you have a campaign that lands with people, that people feel connected to, it's going to be a successful campaign. If you have a campaign that misses the mark, uses words that people don't really connect with, might be a bit too insider baseball based on your workplaces, right? A campaign that makes a lot of sense to you and your colleagues, but it's not going to connect with average people and you need their support, the campaign is not going to be as successful. And so this presentation is going to talk about how to do effective campaigns messaging, the work that needs to go into that, and some ideas that you can use to try and sharpen the campaign messaging that you come up with. And at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about that thing called the Freedom Convoy from the perspective of what they did, I know, right in their campaign messaging, with like a ton of caveats that, okay. Et il faut que je dise aussi que la présentation, ça va être en anglais.
And I have to say that my presentation will be in English. It's important for you to be ready for changes of language, but it will be short. So this presentation will be mainly in English, but if you have questions, I'm very happy to receive them in French. And I think that's just about all I'm going to be saying in French, so thank you for having put your headset on to understand what I'm saying.
The French word. I start with the French word. The French word is la conjoncture. How many people know that word? Yeah, I mean the francophones, right? Of course. And of course, I'm beside the screen with the French, so here I'm like gonna check that out. La conjoncture is a super helpful political concept that is normal in French organizing and in organizing in Quebec that we do not talk about in English Canada for some reason. And it's the moment that we say, okay, what is going on in society, or what is going on in our movement, what is going on in our union, what is going on the ground? What's the political climate? Who's in power? Are they popular? Are they not popular? Because if you're gonna have a popular premier, you can't really have a campaign that's gonna demonize him because he's popular, right? So that's helping to remind us that we are always operating within a political context or political climate that will help us have the most biting campaign messaging. What are people responding to right now? The pandemic has obviously been the biggest part of how people are responding to issues that they're interested in. And so how can we pull out those issues in the campaigns that we're talking about? We get everyone together in a room and we debate where we are at in this moment. And through those discussions, we're able to really sharpen our political messaging and our political context. And we can probably figure out what's going to land and what isn't going to land when we evaluate la conjoncture before we start in our campaigns. So as I say, this is not really something that we do in English Canada. It was, when I moved to Quebec, it was always like, okay, on va commencer avec la conjoncture, right? And you had like a person who's like, well, I'm gonna tell you, this movement's going very well. We can maybe piggyback off of that, or people are really tired, or whatever. Understanding the moment, the political moment, is really, really important when we're coming up with our campaign messaging. So right now, la conjoncture, if we're going to talk about that, well, we've got COVID waves, which are always playing on people's minds. So whether we're going into a wave or we're leaving a wave, it's changing how people are interacting with each other and with society. So all of our campaigns have to understand that people are going to be in different mental states if they're entering a COVID wave or they're leaving a COVID wave. And then if you've got a campaign that's gonna last a couple of months, it has to be durable enough to go with the waves, right? People are angry, they're politically isolated, they're depressed, more depressed probably than ever before. So if we're creating a political campaign and when our audience is depressed and angry, that is going to require a specific kind of campaign that would be different if the general population was like having a good time all the time. There's provincial politics and there's federal politics, and obviously federal politics touch you probably the most, but provincial politics are touching the people that you're probably trying to reach. Certainly provincial politics are gonna be touching your members in the perspective of like the collapsing healthcare system or education, right? These are provincial issues. So really understanding where we are at in a given moment requires understanding the political scene at the federal level and at the provincial level. Of course, there's the war in Ukraine is playing in a lot of people's minds. A lot of people are very concerned by this. They're seeing images of war. They're directly touched by war. So that's going to play a role. Now, this presentation, I should have updated. It's no longer spring. It's summer. And so the summer also is a political context, right? People want to go away, right? People want to hang out. They don't want to necessarily hear about politics. If they do want to hear about politics, it has to kind of fit into that summer kind of spirit, or the fall, or the winter, right? Every season comes with its own kind of feeling. So where you find people, where people are at individually or personally, is where you're going to have to create your messaging and try to reach them at that point. So I've got a couple of different profiles here. I have sad, isolated, angry, inconscient, c'est quoi? Oblivious, of course, thank you. And satisfied, okay? And we're gonna go through these profiles and talk about different kinds of messaging for these kinds of people, all right? Because each of these kinds of people are going to require different political messaging, and if you're not meeting them where they're at, then they're just not, the campaign is not going to land. So let's start with people who are sad. And I think that there is a lot of sadness. We've had mass death. a lot of different kinds of mass death in the last couple of years, whether that's mass death obviously from COVID, or if it's mass death related to COVID, so people who died because care was lacking or because of other factors in the healthcare system, or if it's because of heat waves, or, right? There's a lot of sadness that's generalized in society right now. So if you're trying to reach a population that is sad, well, you have to be what? I mean, it's on the slides. You have to be joyful, right? You have to be surprising, to shake them out of the feeling of sadness, right? And so that's a different kind of campaign. If you can imagine, like if you're demanding, I don't know, a fair bargaining or something like this, and you're reaching people who are sad, you have to kind of get at them in a way that's different than if they were not sad, if they were something else. So if you've got like a population that you're trying to reach that is sad, you have to get out of the norm. You have to really do something surprising and do something joyful to remind people that there are aspects of life that we don't have to be sad about. And actually, this campaign is a joyful campaign, is a surprising campaign. Okay, surprise can be a bit difficult to do, but some of the best campaigns are campaigns that are like surprising. You're like, whoa, I did not expect that from this group. And I'm sure you can all think of different examples of a campaign where you're like, whoa, that was surprising and kind of fun. Okay. What happens if you're trying to reach people who are isolated? Isolation, I think, is probably the feeling that most people have right now. Not just sadness, but actually feeling like they're completely by themselves. And they are. I mean, we have been completely isolated in this pandemic. The pandemic has been this moment where not only are we isolated, but then the only social interaction we have been online, right? We're shopping online, we've got contactless everything. You know, you don't have to run into neighbors anymore. You don't want to run into your neighbors. Or maybe you're going a little bit back to that, but there's still people that are quite isolated. And so isolation's a really difficult spirit to break through because it's so intense and it's so intensely felt. But isolation is also poison to a campaign because all of our campaigns require people to feel solidarity and togetherness and have to break through that isolation. And so when we're trying to connect with an isolated population, and of course, I mean, a lot of our groups of people are going to be a combination of these things, but when we're trying to connect with people who are isolated, you have to bring that connectedness to them. We have to put forward connectedness, but we also have to connect them with people. And your campaigns, you should think about, are there active parts of the campaign that they can then find themselves involved in and connect with individuals, connect with communities, and break that isolation. So using themes and memes from the pandemic can really help with this. We've all got this common experience. And when we talk about common experience, we're able to say, oh yeah, like, you know, remember what April 2020 was like, right? Although, I mean, a lot of us have, memory erasers, so we don't have to think about what it was like. But regardless of where you are in this country, that isolation was a really common experience. And breaking through isolation is really critical for any campaign to work. So what about people who are angry, which will also be a huge chunk of the population? Well, when you've got someone who's angry, you can't respond to anger with like joyfulness, because they'd be like, what the hell's wrong with you, right? Why aren't you angry? So you have to figure out a different way to reach someone with anger, and I would suggest that we have to be righteously angry. We have to demonstrate the anger that they have, but turn it into something that can be used for a means to something, right? So we have to take that anger and actually use it, right? Anger needs to be directed to something, because if it isn't directed to something, it's just going to be swallowed and it's going to be internalized and it can destroy people. And so if we can find a way to create a vessel for them to put their anger into and channel that anger towards maybe the people who are responsible for their anger, maybe that's politicians, maybe that's a way something works within society, you give them a direction for that anger, and then all of a sudden you're able to connect with people in a deeper way. Then you've got folks who are oblivious. When you've got someone who's oblivious, you have to be very clear in your messaging, right? You think, it's like, how could someone not really know what's going on? Like, we're living in such political times. Like, who is the possible person that's oblivious to, whatever, right? But of course, there's a lot of people who are oblivious. It's a coping mechanism. It's a way to get through the chaos of this time. And so we have to be pointed. We have to be clear in what we're talking about when we meet someone who might be oblivious. And we have to, again, use surprise to kind of shake them out of that oblivion. It can be very difficult. This is going to be a group of people that will be hard to reach because they're oblivious on purpose. But that's going to be a lot of people in your communities. And so someone who's oblivious might not be interested in the campaign messaging directly, but might be interested in a campaign event, right? Maybe they were dragged along. Maybe there was free food, right? And we have to think of campaign messaging outside of just the words that we're using, but also the tactics that we might decide to use as well. And so you can bring someone who's oblivious to a barbecue, and then all of a sudden they're eating hot dogs and reading your material, right? And then the campaign messaging might work a little bit better than if you're just trying to get someone through a TV ad or a radio ad or something. Now, what about people who are satisfied? I would say we ignore them because anyone who's satisfied right now doesn't matter because that's not who we're trying to reach. You can't tell someone who's satisfied, oh, actually the world's ending. If they don't know that yet, they're probably in the Conservative Party, right? So if you, at some level, and if you're conservative in the room, that's fine. I got to sit 6 feet away from Jean Charest yesterday. That was kind of neat. He's got a super big head. Yeah, good hair. Oh yeah, the haircuts situation, that's folks who are satisfied are not our audience. And I think that unions forget this, that there's a lot of we'll never please certain people. There'll always be critics. The people who need our campaigns are not satisfied. The people who need our campaigns and our advocacy are the ones who are not satisfied. And when you're not satisfied, you're not organized. When you're not satisfied, you need to become organized to be able to change certain parts about whatever society you want to change. But those who are satisfied, we can ignore them. So there's a whole bunch of things that comprise campaign messaging. And sometimes if you're in comms, you just think, okay, good title of a campaign, good materials, good written materials, maybe good flyers, you gotta have the website, right? But there's a lot more that goes into campaign messaging. Of course, it is slogans and the demands of your campaign. It's also the look of the campaign, right? So is it really harsh colors indicating urgency? Is it really soft colors indicating, that we're all cool and peaceful? Whatever. There's a lot of messages that are put through the campaign that I don't think we always think about. Sometimes you have to really think, where's your campaign coming from? And a lot of unions that have national structures, this can be really challenging because if the messaging comes from a centralized location like Ottawa or Toronto, maybe that's not going to reach the members who live in St. John or in Regina or in Edmonton. So you have to really think about where that messaging's coming from. And then there's the actions that are part of the campaign, the video or the audio content that's part of the campaign. There are a lot of things that we have to consider part. And I think really importantly is how we react to criticism of the campaign becomes part of the campaign messaging. This is, I think, also we don't think very much about, that if someone's criticizing our campaign, the way that we, if you're leading the campaign, the way that the leaders of the campaign respond is part of the campaign messaging, but then also the way that your supporters take on your demands and then respond to critics becomes part of the campaign. And I'm going to talk a little further about that later with the Freedom Convoy. So altogether, this is the sum total of campaign messaging. And so it means that you don't just have a couple of inputs, you have a lot of inputs, and you have a lot of diverse inputs, meaning that you need to have a lot of different people participating in creating this campaign. When I used to work for the Canadian Federation of Students, the difference between our campaigns when we hired an agency to make them versus when we created them ourselves was so obvious. Because the agency campaigns were nice, they were slick, they had good demands, but you could tell that they weren't authentic in the same way as the campaigns that we created around a table, arguing with each other until 5 in the morning to come up with the best messaging. So that can be difficult because it takes time. You have to have people together either online or in a room, but having that diverse and broad-based approach to campaign message creation will get you the best message. Like someone will say something and then everyone will start to coalesce around that saying, oh, that's it, that's the slogan, we got it. You know, rather than a couple of people like maybe disconnected trying to come up with this who might be hired from like externally. So that can be really, really important because if that authenticity is not there, your members will smell it. And that kills so many campaigns. Okay, so let's talk quickly about slogans. It's only part of the campaign, but it is the doorway to your campaign. And a slogan has to be pithy, it has to be precise, and it has to convey a feeling. And I think that this is sometimes hard to appreciate, that sometimes the words actually don't matter at all. In the labor movement, we have a bunch of words that I wish we would just throw out because we're using them all the time. It's like, forward together, unity now, strengthen unity, like all these kind of fairness now, fairness works, fairness for workers, fairness. It's like, does that mean anything? Like, does that, like the word fairness evoke anything? Really? I'm not convinced that it does. I think that when we have slogans or when we have words that we want to associate with the campaign, the words don't actually matter when you put them into a broader campaign framework. And the proof of that is this ridiculous freedom convoy, right? They're not even a convoy anymore, right? And I found myself calling them a convoy as they're walking down Spark Street. It's like, that's not a convoy, what the hell am I saying? Let alone freedom, I mean, my God, right? But when you have the whole package of the messaging, the slogan doesn't matter as much in terms of what the words mean. It's the feeling and the sentiment that the words evoke. So how do we develop that? This is where you want to have a brainstorming session with people who are on the ground, who will say, oh yeah, fairness. The employer keeps using that word. We can't use that word. Okay, good to know, Or, oh yeah, whatever. This issue is going to really bounce off of our membership because they're talking about all the time, right? Or I play on words that you know in your workplace that people will understand, right? So you have these brainstorming sessions and you come up with stuff. You put it all on a screen or on the blackboard or whatever, and see how people in the brainstorming session itself responds to it. And you'll come up with something. You'll always have, as long as you've got a good representation of your membership in the room, you'll always have the best ideas that come up through brainstorming, as many ideas as possible. So I have some slogans here that you can check out. Some are good and some are not good. And I don't know if anyone wants to shout out some of their favorite slogans or their least favorite slogans, but I have some here that are some that I like and some that I do not like. And some you can tell what they're from, right? Fair deal for kids. I hate fair deal for kids. What the hell does that mean? Like a fair deal for a kid is watching TV all day and loving it, right? And adults. Fair deal for adults as well. That's right. Strong communities. Right? Like, okay, yeah, things that aren't super evocative. But then you have the one that I grew up under the shadow of this slogan because my parents were both high school teachers. Cuts hurt kids, right? Anyone in Ontario in the Harris years will remember Cuts hurt kids with the Band-Aids, and that was the rallying cry of the 1997 strikes, right? And then it kind of came back in just before the pandemic in 2020 as education cuts hurt kids. I mean, you don't really have to mess with that. That's a great slogan. Cuts hurt kids, right? And it's like, oh, it does. You don't want to cut up children. Like, that's a really excellent slogan. Does anyone have anyone that they want to yell out or offer to the room as a good example, bad example? Not really? No pressure. Oh, yeah. Say it again? Yes, we can. Yes, we can. Yeah. Obama's campaign. Yeah, yes, we can. That was exactly, right? It evoked the idea that a black man could be elected in the White House, and Obama was going to be that man, and yes, we can together. But at the core of it, I mean, it is a meaningless phrase, and it was so like, yes, we can, right? Perfect to put on like hats and stuff. I mean, in the same sense, we've got Make America Great Again right now, right? Oh boy, yeah. Back to Canada though. One of my least favorite, there was a national union that had a picture of a pie. And the slogan was, "It's time to cut ourselves a slice." You know? And you can imagine how they came up with that. You're like, yeah, public sector workers, like, we need a slice of the pie. But, I mean, you're like, okay, a slice of what, right? Anyway, so there's some slogans that you can look at. And when you're watching other campaigns, you should really pay attention to the slogans and if they evoke something for you. And so we just did that. Okay, so this, I think, is the most important part of the presentation, the word authenticity and being authentic. So authenticity is absolutely key to a good campaign. And I'm not sure if you've noticed, but we are sorely lacking in authenticity in this country in politics. We are so lacking in authenticity that somehow Pierre Poilievre is coming across as an authentic guy, right? And it's like, I mean, he's been training for this since like he was 5, right? He's not super, I mean, I guess he's being very authentic and wanting to be prime minister, but authenticity is like gold to campaigns. It's showing your true desire, your true nature, the role that you play in your communities, the role that you play in your within your province or within the country. It shows what the real spirit of the people that you represent. And oftentimes, I think we try to sanitize authenticity out of our campaigns because it can kind of, like, sometimes being authentic can be brash. Sometimes being authentic can be over the top. Sometimes people don't want to be too spicy. But I think that this has been a huge error of the labor movement in Canada in general, that we've often tried to sanitize authenticity out of our campaigns and tried to make them look like slick corporate entities that we think will bounce best with people. And, like, you know, people right now are looking for hope from people that know what's going on. Like, I have a podcast, so I hear from hundreds of people like every month about how they're just like, why is no one doing anything to fix this country? How come no one's doing anything to save us, right? And the fact is, labor is organized, has resources, has connections, has democratic structures, and is located to do some of the pushback against government, whether that's direct pushback or actually just organizing alternatives that will help their communities. And I think that this is where we see authenticity, that it can be the most powerful, that when you have someone who is speaking about their experiences and their truths in an honest and authentic way, that connects, because so much of reality right now is so fake. Right? I don't imagine anyone in this room, actually maybe, I shouldn't say that, but I imagine that most people in this room, if I surveyed you about what you really thought of Justin Trudeau, you would not say he's an authentic guy. You might like him, you might vote for him, you might hate him. I'm not a huge fan. But I mean, he's not authentic. Like, you can tell that there's like 17 layers of acting going on between what he's doing and the cameras, right? And the reason why people hate him so much is because that especially they can't stand, right? And that, I think, in the provincial levels, there's different variances of authenticity. I think Doug Ford has become more authentic, if you can believe it, and that has helped his popularity. The right does authenticity really, really well. The left does not. You know, Jagmeet Singh is most popular when he's just being himself. When you can tell he's being managed, you're like, what is this? This is not authentic, right? So we have to think about, what does authenticity mean for your locals, for your campaigns, and the location that you occupy in society. How can you talk about the work that you're doing, understanding what's going on in the world right now, and being authentic about it? And because everything's collapsing, I mean, you folks are in critical infrastructure, right? Like, you folks really are able to have a situation of authority and authenticity that very few other people in this country can have. So really think about that, and think about how you can be bold in your authenticity. Some examples of authentic campaigns. I mean, I think the Obama campaign's a really good example. you know, when you see campaigns of of healthcare workers with like their masks like ripping apart their faces and they're crying and all, that stuff's really like touching and really authentic, and you know that that's the reality. There was a campaign that NAPE, the Public Sector Union of Newfoundland Labrador, had in the winter. They had this beautiful video of like getting through the pandemic together. It was narrated by Gordon Pinsent. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? Yes? Okay, you're probably from Newfoundland? Yeah, right. It's a good ad, eh? Did it make you cry a little? No, okay. It's a good one. Yeah, they won a national award for the Canadian Association of Labour Media for that ad. I suggest you check it out because it's so powerful. It's NAPE, N-A-P-E, you can just find it. Because it's like speaking to Newfoundlanders and Labradorians about, like, remember the snowstorm, now we're going through this, now our healthcare system's collapsing, now we need to fight for our public services. So that kind of authenticity is, I think, very touching for people, and it's gonna look different for different kinds of unions, so you really have to think through what that might look like for you. So if you're gonna be authentic, you have to use messaging that avoids jargon. So of course that avoids terms that you're using on a daily basis that I'd be like, I don't know what that is, right? All of our industries are full of jargon, and it can be easy to speak in jargon. And if your campaign is touching just your members, then you can totally jargon it up. But if you're trying to get outside of your members, you wanna really use plain language. You want to avoid being too technical in your campaign messaging. You want to speak from the heart. Like, you know, you want to really be honest without being cheesy. And so you're trying to figure out where that line is. We'll come through brainstorming and discussing. But there is a line there. So, you know, make sure you're not too cheesy. You have to get through to people the gravity of your demands and the gravity of what you're talking about. And that's going to look different based on whatever like industry you're working in. But if you're able to express like, this is why this matters, you'll reach people. And the whole point of reaching people is then to get them into action in some kind of way, right? So then you have to have the list of action items that are there so that they're ready to do if they're touched by the campaign. And this is where I have to like announce that my vision is actually very bad. When the person receives the message, they instantly get it. That's really, really important. And you do that through not exactly having the perfect words, but having the perfect sentiment behind the words. Okay, so let's talk about the trucker convoy. And actually, before I'll even do that, what were you surprised by with the trucker convoy in terms of like, let's not say it was good, but yeah. Go ahead. Oh, great, thank you.
From somebody who actually had to traverse the convoy to get to a workplace, and somebody who pays attention to the bigger picture in the world, how much collective stupidity was involved with this activity. I won't call it anything else because A, it's not polite, B, it's a misnomer. It goes back to your discussion yesterday. They're calling us sheep, but the word's irony.
Yeah, they're like actually shearing one another on the streets. That was a slow burn. Okay. But was there anything that you saw that you were... Okay, here, I'll do mine. So I live in Quebec City. We have this thing called Carnival every year, right? Carnival is, it happens in February, and the Freedom Convoy came into Quebec City like the day Carnival was on, okay? Carnival required a vaccine passport, so the city parked a bunch of heavy trucks between the convoy and the Carnival, and you had like thousands of people here and thousands of people there doing their own thing. And I live on the street that it drove by. It wasn't like Ottawa. They didn't occupy the downtown. They weren't allowed to occupy the downtown. But we did have constant trucks driving by two sides of my apartment for the whole day. And I was like losing my mind because the horns are really loud, right? And at 4 o'clock, someone knocks on my door and I'm thinking, oh my God, who's this? And it was a friend of mine who's like, hey, just checking in, like you're in like really in the thick of things, how you doing? I'm like, oh, it's fine. I hate this, but it's fine. And he was like, people have closed the streets. They've taken over the downtown. I hate what they're doing. I hate their messaging, but you gotta love seeing a closed street. Right? And I was like, okay, yeah, that's true, right? You go outside, every single person had the goofiest smile. It was the first time for a lot of these people to actually be outside and be joyful in this pandemic. And for me, that was the moment where I realized, like, the left really didn't think through the need for release and doing release in a way that was safe, that wasn't gonna spread the virus, but that did allow people to feel like they were a part of something. And when you're juxtaposing that with Carnival, which, I mean, traditionally is an anti-authoritarian crazy party, right? Where people do lots of, I mean, it's Quebec City, so no one's getting naked, right? But they would. I mean, some do. But it is -40, right? People are going nuts, right? Sortant s'en fout is the slogan from this year. And many people made that connection in Quebec City saying, the carnival is, I mean, the Freedom Convoy is a carnival of sorts. Like, it really is people getting together and doing this ridiculousness together. And it helped me remind myself that, yes, while I'm off, this is off-putting and I cannot stand these people. And I mean, I took a picture of one guy who laid on his horn for 20 minutes. I was like, oh my God. And then he like threatened to sue me, and you're like, okay, because I posted his picture and his name and phone number online. I mean, obviously, right? Which was awesome, because I was just like, okay, I'll see you in court. Like, that will be fun, I guess. And of course, he never sued me. But it did remind me that what we were seeing and why it was so popular was because the campaign dovetailed exactly where society was. Even though they only appealed to like 10% of Canadians, I think that most people could feel, if they were angry at it, they were angry also recognizing that we don't have anything to do this for ourselves. There was no attempt to break the isolation. There was no attempt to get people together and actually have that goofy smile walking around the street with a beer kind of thing. Right, actually similar to how a lot of folks in St. John's dealt with the massive snowstorm, right? By carving out seats and sitting together and being together while everything's buried in snow, right? So let's talk about some of the campaign messaging from the Freedom Convoy. And the caveats are, it is a white supremacist movement. There's no question about that. And that what they did to the city of Ottawa, I know residents are still traumatized by that. That's not funny or fair or justifiable. But now I'm going to speak positively about the convoy. So number one, they had bold messaging that united like province to province. And as national organizations, as someone who has worked at national organizations, I know that is not easy. Right? Journalists often put them across as being this like wayward bunch of fools that were totally unorganized and whatever, but it's like, no, but the same flag is flying down the street from my parents in Georgetown, Ontario, that's being driven outside of my house in Quebec City. Like, a message that crosses political lines like that is a coordinated message, a very thought out, coordinated message. And like, of course, like, you know, the messaging, because it was bold, like, end mandates now, fuck Trudeau, right? I mean, they're evocative, they don't say much. The end mandates now language is a really good example because, you know, they weren't even targeting the right level of government, as many of you know. Like, none of them were federal public sector workers, or probably very few of them were. And they're like, Trudeau, end mandates now. And he's like, no, like, what mandate, right? It doesn't matter. It didn't matter that it was fake. It didn't matter that it wasn't exactly how it was real. It didn't matter that every single journalist was like, well, actually, there is no mandate, right? Didn't matter, because they're like, we have bold messaging. Our messaging is going to transcend the fact that you're calling us idiots, and we don't care about that. And like overthrowing the government, right? Straight up being like, we're going to overthrow the government. Wow, okay, that's a message, right? That it doesn't mean they're going to overthrow the government. It evokes a feeling of overthrowing the government. Those are two different things. And it trapped a lot of journalists being like, huh, you're going to overthrow the government? You, who don't even know Section 92 of the British North America Act, you're going to, you know, it's like, It may completely, they're like, yeah, we're gonna overthrow the government. And then average people who were susceptible to that were like, yes, we're overthrowing the government, right? On the left, there's no similar kind of, we don't mess around with like facts like that. We're too shy to mess around with facts like that. We'd be embarrassed if CTV came and said, well, Nora, you know that you can't overthrow the government by walking into it, right? Doesn't matter, because that's the messaging they evoked. That was the spirit that they evoked, and it worked for the people that they were targeting. And then the people that they weren't targeting, they didn't care about them. Okay. Yeah, so moving into, they did not care what critics thought about them. And I think that this is something Labor needs to learn as well. They did not speak to people who disagreed with them. They didn't care about us. They didn't care about us at all. In fact, they would just give us the finger. And you're like, okay, right? So they had a really defined idea of who their audience was, and they played to that audience to like maximum program. They didn't worry that their demands were ridiculous. They didn't try to speak to people that would say, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. They went full bore towards the population that they were trying to target. And that actually was part of the authenticity piece, because they were like, you can't tell us what to do. I don't care if you don't agree with us, you're all sheep, you know? So when we're thinking of how this kind of, we can do these kinds of things on the left, I mean, there's obviously not a direct, okay, we'll take that and we'll do that. But it should open our minds to the possibilities of what we can say and how we ignore critics. Because, you know, I mean, if we pay too much attention to the critics, then we're not going to do anything, right? Okay, multiple platforms to get out their messages. This was partly because the campaign became so popular that they let the campaign messaging become the property of the adherents. And so this was very decentralized. There was no central command saying, whoa, 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 that's a little bit too far outside of what we're doing. Let's dial it back. They were just like, this is your campaign now, go with it. And that became part of campaign messaging. And it was tough because it meant that, like, you know, when people were flying literal like Nazi flags, then journalists were like, oh, you got Nazis in there. And the leadership's like, what are you talking about? And they're like, there's Nazis right there. No, there's not. No, here's a picture of a literal Nazi flag. No, he's saying Justin Trudeau's the Nazi, not him. You know, and then you're like in like banana land trying to explain this, right? It didn't matter because they're just like, this is, well, yeah, maybe there's some Nazis. I mean, I'm not a Nazi, but I haven't surveyed everybody, so maybe. I mean, what? We're broad-based. Of course there's gonna be some Nazis, it's Canada. You know, like, there's just some ways that they just did not care about who was taking on the messaging. Now, union campaigns have to be much more kind of careful than that, obviously. But I think often we're a little too careful, we're a little too afraid to allow membership to take messages and go with it. But when you have a campaign where the membership feels like they can do that, that's when you've hit a sweet spot where you know you're actually resonating with average people. I'm thinking, you know, the British Columbia Teachers Federation, during the last set of strikes that they had, that was really key, was making sure that teachers were feeling empowered to take that message and then own that message and then be angry if a politician were to say anything about the union, but then you had like, well, I'm the union. We're all the union. You're insulting the province's teachers. You know, that's the sweet spot, is to make sure that that campaign feels owned by everybody there. And that does mean that you will have some people who get a little bit off message, right? Who say the wrong thing. And we just have to allow for that kind of freedom among people to maybe be off script. And then, you know, if it became a media issue, then you can deal with it however you want to deal with it, but to not insist that people toe a specific line. I think that that's really, really important. And, you know, they were across platforms. So they were all across social media, as you know. They had people just in their car talking, right, on their video blogs. Mainstream media was all over it, not something that we can replicate very easily on the left, but the multi-platform coverage that they had helped to blow up what is a fringe movement into something that looked like it was more mainstream. So the coordinated actions and branding is I think a really key part of the campaign messaging that we can learn from as well. So when when the occupation happened here, when the border crossing was shut down in Alberta, and then the border crossing was shut down in Windsor, journalists were still like acting as if this was random and chaotic, right? And I was sitting there going, oh my God, these guys, like they are literally shutting border crossings. I mean, like we'd be shot if we did that, okay? But there's obviously a level of coordination that journalists do not want to admit on the air. And there's a bunch of reasons that are legitimate for why they might not want to suggest that, but when you have something that is so coordinated, that is attacking many nodes in a country, that's strategic. They're being very, very, very strategic and very coordinated while giving the image of being completely not coordinated at all. I mean, driving from one end of the country to the other takes coordination. I mean, obviously, right? So they were taking up space, physical space, occupations, right? They had the airwaves through social media and mainstream media coverage, and they had these common messages that really gave this idea an impression of unity. We don't know if they're actually united. I've been researching and following the far right for 20 years, and I can tell you that within a couple of weeks, like every single far right movement always collapses because they end up like really fighting each other. So I don't imagine they're that united, but the image came forth that they were united. And these flags were all across Canada. I think it really hit me when I was seeing all of the messaging in Quebec was in English, which is so weird to see folks from the Beauce with English signs. It's like, when do you see that? You never see that. But the branding was so strong, it didn't matter what the sign said. It didn't matter, like that actually crossed the language barrier in a way that most campaigns don't at all. So that was very weird. And then also, seeing Canadian flags flown in Quebec City was also super weird and like, okay, you guys can have that. But they were more coordinated than I think that we want to admit. And so when we're thinking through our national campaigns, again, it has to be something that is simple, that doesn't necessarily have very specific language so that it can work in Victoria the same way it will work in Windsor. But that national branding is really, really important because people will start to run into it more and they'll start to see it. And this is also where symbolism doesn't need to be very complicated, right? Like probably the most powerful symbol, political symbol in the last, 3 decades in Canada was a red square, like a literal red cut out of fabric square. And that was a symbol of the Quebec student strikes. And students all across Canada and across the world started to wear the red square. It wasn't popular because it was simple. It became the symbol of a popular movement that was powerful, that was authentic, and that was winning. And so that also helps to make your symbols like get launched into the stratosphere. But it was something that average people could cut out of felt and stick on their own backpack. And so that kind of thing, the red square didn't say anything. There was no message on it, but everybody who was in that movement knew exactly what it meant. So thinking through really simple symbols, I think can be also a very powerful way to evoke campaign messaging. So their messaging was also completely chaotic if you think about what the words meant. But because they were evocative and they had created this campaign, it didn't matter that the messages were chaotic and didn't make any sense. So, in the beginning, no one really knew what to call them. And so people would default to the Truckers' Convoy because that's what they called themselves, or the Freedom Convoy, right? Truckers' Convoy suggested they were truckers. That created one kind of scandal when it was like, oh, actually most truckers do not agree with you. They didn't care. They're like, we don't care that we're not truckers. So that gave critics a very narrow thing to criticize. They're not real truckers. Real truckers are these people. These are fake truckers. Yeah, but they got trucks, but they're owner-operators. What's an owner-operator? They're small businesses. That's the petit bourgeois. And then that's the debate that you're having rather than what they're actually talking about. So that actually was a bit of a trap, right? Where they're like, they had the trucker convoy come in and they were all motorcycles. And you're like, wait, those aren't trucks, those are motorcycles. Are you people idiots, right? And they're like, we don't care, right? So again, it was about the spirit of the campaign and not the words that they were using. I already talked about end all mandates. And then making it all about Trudeau when most of the decisions were made at the provincial level. Again, it was a trap where people like pedants would be like, Trudeau didn't put the mandate on in your province. We don't care. Okay, right. Very, very interesting. They also didn't need a single slogan. And so this is also something we can learn from, that maybe our campaigns don't need a single slogan, that maybe campaign messaging can bring together lots of different kinds of slogans that are united through branding or united through a specific demand or a specific period of bargaining or whatever. When they're packaged together, they can be disparate messages. They don't need to be connected. They don't need to rhyme. They don't need to be referring to the same thing. They can just be part of this glob of a campaign. And if your members take it on and run with it, well, then you're golden. Then the whole thing has been packaged for you. Okay, so there's about 10 minutes left, and I want to have a couple of questions for sure. But beyond the convoy, so as I say, the most important thing I think is to strive to be authentic. People are desperate for authenticity right now. They want to hear authenticity. And so your campaigns, your leadership, the way that you interact with people in the communities and with journalists has to be authentic. You should strive to name problems directly. And so this is also something that we find ourselves kind of turning in circles within labor, that sometimes we're not just plainly saying the problem, that we're trying to soften it, we're using euphemisms, right? Rather than just being like, no, they want to fire us, or they want to outsource this, they want to eliminate these jobs. We know how to speak directly, but I think that there's this kind of professional communications kind of thing that happens where to sound like we're serious, to sound like we are professional, we soften and we use euphemisms. Don't. Speak directly to the people that you're trying to target, and use words that you know will evoke a feeling from the people you're trying to reach. Brainstorm and work collectively. None of this is going to come out of the mind of a single person. And the more people you have involved in this kind of work to try and come up with your campaign messaging together, the stronger your messaging is going to be. Because your messaging is going to be confronted by management, by government, and by media. And so if you have messaging that's a little bit shaky, the second you start to get assaulted by let's say, by government or by journalists, if it collapses, or if people can see that it's not able to withstand the weight of the words that it's being used, then you've got a problem. So you really have to brainstorm and figure out, what are those slogans, what is the messaging, what is the concepts, what are the actions that will not be able to be cut down by critics. And try to have some fun. Things aren't super fun these days, and so if you want people to get involved in your stuff, you have to offer them a feeling that is not doom, that is not like, this is a slog, that is not like, oh, my union, right? That has to be fun. And so that means that you do work for your communities, like cleaning up shorelines or whatever. That means that you have parties, that you have park festivals, that you hire bands from time to time, and you invite people that are not just in your membership, and you create those nodes of community. Because if we're not doing that, then no one is going to help you at bargaining. It's just that simple. There's just nothing in the community's interest to help you if we're not actually going out and being part of community. So when we're thinking of our campaigns and the message, it's like, we are part of this community. We care about the people we serve. We're doing our best in the most professional and safe way to keep you all safe. But also we want you to have fun. And this is how we're going to do it. So think about injecting fun into your campaigns. And that's it. So we got 7 minutes left for questions. Don't know if anyone has it, or comments, or actually, Nora, the Freedom Convoy is good.
Thanks very much for your presentation. Excellent. I want to share a convoy that I was part of before the convoy.
Okay.
But I think it actually speaks to something that PSAC did really well. We have a directly chartered local in Vancouver at Granville Island. And if you've been to Vancouver, Granville Island is a major tourist destination. They were facing serious concessions at the bargaining table. So some of us in the PSAC, we got our own little car convoy together. And we went down on a Saturday, and we had slogans, and yeah, we took our lumps. There were some people in the crowd who were not pleased, and they were yelling. We had someone threaten to lay themselves down in front of us and get hit by our vehicle. So like, yeah, if you're willing to take your lumps, but you have a clear slogan, you're fighting for what you believe in, it worked. Actually, management got super embarrassed by having hundreds of tourists witness this spectacle, and at the same time, to watch the workers at Granville Island leave their post to come to the street and start clapping for us. Also, made the connection with the tourists, like, oh, they're here for the workers who, after this convoy leaves, we want to go and get ice cream. Oh, right, that's the workers. So it all kind of tied together, and they didn't have to face any concessions when they finally got in a collective agreement. So I just want to share that as an idea of like, about your saying, clear messaging, but we were willing to take a stand and willing to take like public lumps from some people. But if you're willing to do it, I think we got some really good benefit.
Thank you. And actually, if you're doing work around tourists, like the thing that I find so funny is like tourists are usually like from somewhere. Like they know what unions are, and they're usually like really curious about what's going on. Like they want to know what the campaign is. And there might be PSAC members in that crowd who will want to see their flag. You know, in Quebec City, the Calèche drivers, the people that drive Calèche, the horse and buggies, half of them are actual like anarchists. And we know that. And we know that during actions, we can get Calèche drivers to like tell people to come to different actions or to carry a flag and stuff. It's amazing. And so knowing that about where you're located is really important, and making that stuff simple so that someone walking by can be like, oh, I love, like, because this is the thing, is that it's like, if I see a protest, I'm like, is this a good protest or a bad protest? And I have 30 seconds to figure that out. You know, and if the slogans are like weird or not clear, there's no union flags, I'm like, ooh, it's a bad protest, you know, and then I'm like, I'm gonna get out of here. If it's a good protest, I'm like, yeah, I don't even care what you're protesting. So, you know, we need to have more faith, I think, in the public to understand what our messaging is and what we're trying to do, and being really bold and being like, yeah, we're here to make sure you get good ice cream. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
You speak about simple slogans and stuff. Just right off the bat, you take a slogan like the Canadian flag, right? You look like it's torn apart, right? Wrinkle, staple together, right? It's a message, and then put Band-Aids on it because of the healthcare mess that we're into. Because my daughter works in the healthcare in Nova Scotia, and that's a mess. And my view is it looks plain, but makes some point directly and targets the people that's affected with the so what do you think of that slogans?
That's good. No, that's exactly it. It's like you're taking things, a symbol that people know very well, and you're remixing it. So that's exactly the kind of thinking, and then you would present that to maybe a table of people, and people would say, oh, that's great, or, oh, what about instead of staples, we'll use stitches, or what is, but no, not stitches, let's use porcupine quills, you know, oh, that's an interesting, you know, there's other ways, you know, that's when you start to brainstorm together and say, oh, I like where you're going with this, that works. Or, ooh, tattered Canadian flag, my veteran brother says that would be really bad. Okay, let's, maybe not the flag, maybe a beaver that's got a bandage on his head, right? With a droopy Canadian flag. You know, just, this is how you do it, right?
Yeah, because you still have the language barriers between provinces and stuff as well.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks. Yeah.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
No, I appreciate the point about not being too worried about the message, right? And I know in St. John's we had a couple of long strikes at the airport. I was involved in the media, and you know, a lot of times you got to be careful with the message. You don't want to piss off the public. You want to try to engage the public. Well, to me, we were talking to our members who were standing on the picket line for 11 months, who, you know, they wanted to feel that their message was getting out, and we wanted the employer to get the message. If the public was pissed off, that was okay because they were paying attention. So I like that, and I think you know, we need to be more mindful of that, that we're not worried about, because the public is polarized, right? You're sometimes only getting half of them anyway. So anyway, thank you.
Yep, that's right. And the employer is going to say that the public is mad, obviously. The employer is going to say that. And so if you expect, if your goal is to make sure that every person on the picket line feels absolutely supported for however long this is going to take, then you got your audience. Then it's not the public, and that's totally fine. Sure, yeah. I can't see very well, so just start talking. I'll hear you.
Yeah, speaking of messaging, I believe it was in the early 2000s. I'm Nick, by the way, from local 00056. We've got a lot of land, a lot of members. The mobilization can be pretty difficult, but the messaging that year was Parks Canada cut to the bone, and our t-shirts and our flags were a skeleton beaver.
Nice.
You didn't have to read it, you didn't have to do anything. Everybody understood, it was perfect, so. Zombie beaver.
Zombie beaver, very cool. Yeah. Great, yeah.
Thanks a lot. Your presentation, like yesterday, is electric.
Thank you. I charged myself up this morning.
It's something about aggressive messaging. Is there a risk, actually two parts of this question. Can aggressive messaging potentially turn off some of your target? And the second one is it possible to even use like focus groups to be able to derive a better tone or elements in your messaging?
Yeah, okay, so focus groups is a professional way of saying like talk to your members. You know, and I know a lot, at the national level, I know some unions will hire focus groups and do that to workshop their campaigns. I would say that you should be doing that, but with your members. And so whether that is a committee or a couple of committees, or you put a call out with pizza and say, look, we're trying to figure out some new messaging, why don't you come and check it out? Yes, that's a way to get around. If you don't have a structure that allows you to have a brainstorm with like 20 people in the room, then you're gonna wanna try and get a bunch of people together, however that's possible. I'm a little skeptical of the professional focus group approach, because you know your members the best, you know what they're gonna say, you can organize that yourself, you don't need a professional company to come in and kind of do that, but it will definitely give you feedback. So yes, if you don't have any other mechanism than trying to create, focus group on new campaign, like come out to this restaurant or something like that, that can be very effective for sure. When messaging backfires, yeah, so this is where you have to, when you're brainstorming, say, okay, so what might backfire with what we're saying? Well, if you don't have the conversation about la conjoncture, you might find yourself with, I don't know, some sort of message that puts you right at odds with something else that you actually support, let's say. I don't know, I'm trying to make something up on the spot. But if you are aware of the political context, if you're aware of where the provincial government's at, the federal government's at, you're bargaining, the demands that you have, other demands that might be similar with other workers that might be in your industry or that might be going on right now, you can better anticipate traps to make sure that it doesn't backfire. And the opposite example of that is like when the Alberta Federation of Labor was so on top of Jim Prentice's government in Alberta, they knew like they were really, really sharp. The campaigns were like following Prentice very, very closely, and they were trying to speak to the base in Alberta that would listen to them. And they came up with a campaign slogan, which was time to look at yourself in the mirror. And they had created all the campaign materials saying Jim Prentice needs to look at himself in the mirror. And Prentice, before they launched the campaign, actually said Albertans need to look at themselves in the mirror. And the AFL was like, oh my God. Oh my God. So there's like, when you're really on top of what the political context is and what's happening and in the direction that things are happening, you actually can find yourself anticipating what government's going to do. And the Freedom Convoy did that as well. I mean, it wasn't a coincidence that they picked a time at the end of a wave where governments were gonna drop mandates. And then they look like they had success. So we should be doing that as well. But you have to be careful to not have things backfire.
Thank you. Thank you, Nora. We have a little gift as a as a thank you for coming out and visiting us today. I think we took a lot of great information out of this as far as how to get a successful campaign and a lot of good tips and tricks of how to be successful.